Hello, this is Amanda Moreno talking to you today about Uranus and the moon. Um, I think I always say this with my lectures, but this can be as much of a discussion as you guys want it to be, especially with this one because it's more of an opportunity to kind of synthesize information and talk out ideas if you want it. So feel free to interrupt me at any time, and I'll also take breaks to ask questions. So I'm going to talk about the archetypes. So Cancer, Moon, fourth house, and Aquarius, Uranus, 11th house. We're going to talk about trauma, what that looks like. We'll talk about, past life carryovers of trauma. And then we'll talk about the combination of Uranus and the moon as an archetypal pair, and how that can come through, and probably end the conversation with some talk about healing generational trauma, because that's what I'm seeing coming through in my practice with my clients a lot these days. So with Aquarius, Uranus, and the 11th house, we're dealing with the 11th sign of the zodiac. And so it's a lot about the transpersonal or collective realms. But we're dealing with the sign or the archetype of innovation, and forward thinking. A lot of people will use the word progressiveness with Aquarius, or humanitarianism. And part of that has to do with it being, one of the air signs. And so it's associated with the mind. And because it's fixed, it's the ability to demonstrate or display what has gone on in the air signs so far. So in Gemini, we're kind of, mapping and learning about new things. And then in Libra, we're bringing it out into relationship and learning about who we are and are not, based on compare and contrast in relationship. And then in Aquarius, we are coming in to demonstrate the abilities of the mind. The first astrology book I ever read said something about Aquarian types, or people with Aquarius suns, being able to travel further in their mind in one day than most people do in a year. And that was something that really resonated for me. I have an Aquarius sun. And so there's this incredible synthesis of information that's going on. And so we get Aquarius associated with the archetype of the exile, or, the scientist or the mad scientist, or, robotics and engineering and things like that. So we have that innovation and invention component to Aquarius and Uranus. And I am conflating the three, Aquarius, Uranus, and the 11th house, as kind of one archetypal grouping. If it's helpful for you to differentiate between them, I tend to look at houses as areas of life. So the 11th house would be like community and tribe, planets as forces or actors in that area of life, and then signs as the styles through which those actors perform. And it can be helpful to kind of break them up like that sometimes. So with the innovation and invention, you can see that as taking the creativity of Leo, which is the opposite of Aquarius, and bringing it into usefulness, into serving the collective. So that's what kind of takes it out of the subjective experience of Leo and brings it into more long-term relevance. And so with Aquarius and Uranus, there's this need for liberation that's happening. Liberation is one of the main keywords that I use when I'm talking about Aquarius usually. And the purpose of that liberation is from the conditioning factors of Saturn and Capricorn, which came just before it. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this liberation is directly linked to the process of individuation. So individuation is a term that was used by Carl Jung in his form of psychology, and it's referring to, and side note, you'll have to excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold going on. So individuation is referring to the process of hearing the call of your soul, hearing the call of your genius, and then following that path. Okay, so it's not to be confused with individualism. It's very different. Individualism is kind of what I would say a lot of the American kind of cultural ethos is, which is like be as different as you can be for the sake of being different, for the sake of being unique. And individuation is not that. It is a process of, again, kind of like figuring out or hearing what it is that you're here on the earth to do, and then taking steps to do that. And the reason that's relevant to our conversation about trauma is because that that process is often very isolating. So here we see the exile, the archetype of the exile coming through again. Um, because oftentimes when you follow the call of your soul rather than the call of the path that society sets out for you through Capricorn, there is a sense of isolation that comes with it. There is a sense that of being different and unique, yes, but also trauma associated with it. And if we look to history for examples, we often see that people who strike out on their own path are often ridiculed, killed, maimed, and meet some other kind of violent fate, whether it's physical violence, emotional violence, or what have you. So in a lot of ways, this liberation, this individuation is from conditioning patterns. Okay, so Uranus and Aquarius are associated with sudden flashes of insight. So those are insights that come through dreams and then can be acted on, or just when you're walking down the street, something all of a sudden occurs to you. And it also relates to the detached mind or the witnessing observer. So again, wherein, Leo, we are very immersed in our own subjective experience, and that's more of the like, what is unique about me, what is different about me, I need recognition. In Aquarius, we kind of zoom out and we get objectivity, or we gain perspective over something. We're able to kind of watch what's happening. And so that's why sometimes I say, when Aquarius is in combination with, Scorpio, which it squares, or Cancer, it can be really helpful in that Cancer and Scorpio are so emotional, right? They get stuck in the kind of like the turmoil and the waves. And so then Aquarian energy used helpfully with that combination can be the ability to process afterwards, right? So like the emotion happens, we witness it, we experience it, we go through it, and then we zoom out and say, okay, what was happening there? Rather than just bypassing it or getting stuck in the emotion. Okay, so in its healthiest forms, Aquarian and Uranian energy are helping us to get awareness. Now, when we're talking about Uranus as the kind of planet of sudden shocks and breakthroughs, oftentimes that level of awareness or objective thinking comes through sudden jolts and shocks, right? It's shocking us out of our ruts. It's shocking us out of the areas where we're stuck, so that we can move forward. And usually, or oftentimes, that's a pretty painful process. So where we see this kind of theme of zooming out, we can also relate that to Uranus as the higher octave of Mercury. Okay, so Mercury represents short-term memory. Again, it's rulership of Gemini, where it's kind of this mapping energy, and it's getting information that's for use to us today. Uranus is long-term memory, so that's memory that spans lifetimes. And oftentimes the material in the Uranian memory are things that are unconscious, so we don't quite remember, and then they appear to us as flashes of insights or things that we think came from out of nowhere. That's the Uranian memory that's kind of tapped into the collective unconscious, as well as our personal stream of past life experiences. So it's the fragmented material that returns to us suddenly. And that can also be seen as that kind of like divine spark of inspiration that, again, belongs to the Leo Aquarius axis, with the Leo energy being where we tap into that energy, and then the Aquarian energy being where we apply it and use it for humanity. So those are the kind of like ideas that manifest in the world just when we need them, right? They kind of come in to save the day. Okay. So when it comes to Uranus, a lot of times in evolutionary astrology, and this is, a Mark Jones thing, and I believe a Jeff Green thing as well, we talk of Uranian signatures in the birth chart as being trauma signatures. So that's, Uranus in the chart, planets in the 11th house, planets in Aquarius, planets that are aspecting any of those three create trauma signatures in the chart. And this is relevant because understanding how those past life traumas play out can help us to understand trauma in the current life, creating that also creates a liberating experience, right? So there's the mental aha that happens. Um, any questions so far? Okay, so let me just talk about this a little bit more in terms of the developmental process that's happening here. Most of you know that I talk about astrology a lot of times in terms of a developmental wheel, starting with Aries and then moving through the 12 archetypes. And when we deal with the third quadrant of the zodiac, so that's the 10th, 11th, and 12th houses, or Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, we're dealing with the transpersonal energies. So we've kind of like gone through the whole adventure of the first 9 houses, and then we get to building a society and the laws and the structures of society in Capricorn. And so Uranus is always seeking to decondition and break free of the structures of the Saturnian Capricornian society. Um, so there, and its confines. So there's a natural tension that's going on there, and that's made even more so when we think of Aquarius as being traditionally ruled by Saturn. So that gives Saturn some sway in Capricorn and Aquarius. And so when we get to Aquarius, it's that kind of like, you know, what structures of society are working and which ones are not, and how do we break those down? Now, because humans tend to wait until it hurts enough, or until, you know, we have catastrophe in order to change, that kind of feeds into the more traumatic sense of Uranian breakthrough. But it also shows you that that's where that individual spark of genius comes in to break down those old structures. And so we, as we follow the call of our individual spark of genius, we kind of begin to rebel and reject the Capricornian forms. And then that can get into this kind of dynamic of being punished and rejected because of our difference, right? Because of our need to break free. So again, it's that struggle between individuation and consensus. And so we can talk about that in terms of the consensus states, as we talk about in evolutionary astrology, or the individuated states. And so when those traumatic events happen, when that difference is punished, or when the structures come tumbling down, that's when we have a traumatic experience happen. And that's what can lead to more chronic disassociation, which is the Piscean end of the spectrum. So what is trauma? I'm going to read you a quote from Patricia Walsh's book, Understanding Karmic Complexes. It kind of sums that up. So a traumatic event is any overwhelming experience, physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual, that has caused an inability in the psyche to integrate that experience fully and continue in the same manner as before the traumatic event was experienced. Thus, trauma leaves a lasting and damaging impression that manifests as a combination of symptoms, including but not limited to chronic disassociation, anxiety, phobias, fears, hypervigilance, inhibitions, paranoia, neurosis, avoidance, armoring or rigidity, suppression of emotions, emotional or physical numbness, mental confusion, compulsions, etc. In psychological language, combinations of these symptoms are classified as post-traumatic stress disorder syndrome, PTSD, or PTSS. Okay, so when we're talking about Uranian trauma signatures, we're typically talking about mental trauma. And that's distinct from Plutonian trauma, which is more of the emotional psychological trauma. And oftentimes there's a lot of overlap, right? But what we're dealing with here is the notion that when we're experiencing a traumatic event, we have the fight, flight, or freeze response, right? And usually oftentimes we can't flee. And so what happens is as the body's undergoing trauma, then the mind goes somewhere else, right? The mind splits off. There's a process of fragmentation that happens. In shamanic cultures, that's called soul loss. In psychological cultures, it's called fragmentation or disassociation. And this is more of the severing energy of Uranus. Again, it's trying to break us free from the things that restrict us, but in the sense of trauma, it is trying to serve our individuation, but it is causing us to kind of like go away in some ways. And so, you know, the most obvious example is when we, you know, listen to a lot of reports from people who experience childhood sexual abuse or physical abuse, and they report looking down at the body, at their body, while the abuse is happening. Again, so part of the mind, the Aquarian function, goes somewhere else. So again, we can kind of understand this through the interplay of Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, where there's a kind of like punishment dynamic between Capricorn and Aquarius, and then the dissociation dynamic. And so Uranus is the lightning bolt that happens to cause the trauma. All right. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. This is Barbara. In terms of those signatures with an 11th house north node, might that be an indicator of evolutionary growth through trauma? It's also my north node's in Pisces, which you said was associated with traumatic dissociation. So.
Yeah, I would say yes, the north node in the 11th house could be a sign of, I tend to see the north node in the 11th house or Aquarius as breaking free of the mental structures that have kind of restricted growth before or caused problems. But, honestly, when I look at astrology, it's like everything's connected, right? But then the Piscean dissociation piece is in place there. And I don't want to pathologize everything, right? So when we're looking at karmic structures, yes, there is a tendency towards the negative or shadow side of these things. But oftentimes with an Aquarian or 11th house north node, there's an intention to get objectivity or gain perspective. So again, to kind of lift out of getting stuck in the Leo subjective experience, and relying on the mind a little bit more.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Anyone else?
I had a quick thought as you were talking. I'm kind of wondering, is Uranus serving the purpose also? I kind of think of it as the circuit breaker panel in your house. So when too much trauma, electricity is going through there, it shuts it off to keep from damaging the rest of the system.
Yeah, it's a short circuit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was just something I just kind of thought of.
Totally. So, Uranus in the chart, when I first started learning astrology, the thing that made the most sense to me when I was interpreting Uranus in the chart was to think of it as wherever it is by house is where you are creating a new mythology for that house. So, Uranus in the 7th house is creating a new mythology of relationship, or in the 4th house, creating a new mythology of what family looks like. And I think that that's a really empowering way to look at it. It's a way of helping people to embrace their difference, and show you might have a spark of genius in these areas, but it can also show where there has been a lot of pain, right? So, in the 2nd house, it would be creating a new myth of value. 3rd house, communication. So just kind of using it more simply like that in the empowering sense. But if we start to bridge it into the moon and at the Cancerian side of things, what is the moon? It is, in EA, we talk about the moon as kind of like the ego identity, right? I think about it as if we're coming to the developmental wheel, we get to the 4th house, and that's where we identify as a member of our family. That's the first ego identification that we have. And then in Leo, we express that ego. So it's kind of like a dual ego signs. But generally speaking, the moon is what we need to feel safe and secure and fulfilled and emotionally stable. And our ego identity, our identification with our family is the first thing that, hypothetically speaking, provides us with a sense of security. It's that sense that it's a need for security through self-image. And part of that is because it's in direct response to the original wound, which is the separation from source. So we look at the trine from Pisces there, but we also look at the square from the 1st house in Aries, where Aries is all of this just raw, impulsive energy to be without thought. without consideration. And then as we travel through the first 3 signs in Gemini, we start to get an understanding of consciousness and concepts. And so we realize between Gemini and Cancer that we are separate, right? That we're no longer in the womb, we're no longer in the divine womb, and there's a deep sense of insecurity that comes through in the sign Cancer. You can also look at that through the moon's connection with the lunar cycles, right? So the moon is changing signs every 2.5 days. So it's constantly shifting. Our emotional bodies are constantly shifting. The waters of the earth are constantly shifting. There's no security there. And so there is a fundamental insecurity in Cancer and the moon. And so there's this kind of egocentric structure of consciousness, and that's also the relationship, the polarity of Capricorn coming in, that helps us to feel safe, right? And it's an externalization of power, essentially, but it's a necessary part of growth. And so anything that threatens that sense of ego identity or security feels really bad in Cancer, right? So when we bring Uranus and the moon together, we can see that it probably doesn't feel that great. And that can be understood also in terms of the quincunx between the two. So Aquarius and Cancer exist as an inconjunct aspect. And so that is an aspect that indicates crisis, because the two things don't have anything in common, right? So like oppositions can also have that kind of tension of the opposites feeling and not be very comfortable, but at least they have the modality in common. Trines have the elements in common. With quincunxes, there is, again, hypothetically speaking, no like reconciling. And so it's figuring how to integrate these seemingly disparate parts. The moon being emotional and changeable, and Aquarius being not very emotional at all on its own, or very aloof. And so there is a detachment from the emotional body that oftentimes exists when these two things are combined in a chart, or in a human's experience. So when Uranus is aspecting the moon, there can be, that is a trauma signature, and there's something to do with trauma that's associated with a sense of self or conditioning, or a sense of personal security, or insecurity related to the experience of parenting or being parented. And oftentimes it is some kind of inconsistency or insecurity that has to do with the actual, the primary caregiver, which has tended to be the mother, although I think that's shifting somewhat in society. But, people with just like the moon in Aquarius can be very erratic or aloof or detached. But they also find, emotional fulfillment or emotional security through connections with friends and community and tribe. So they need friends and community. Okay, any questions there?
Yes, Amanda. What if the early childhood environment was very traumatic and, the child did not feel safe, did not feel secure? What would you say about that?
Yeah, so I think that's a classic, Uranus in the 4th house, or Pluto in the 4th house type of experience. And so the way that we understand that is in evolutionary astrology is that there's an evolutionary intention for the soul to develop security from within, right? And so they're essentially experiencing things in childhood that are throwing them back in on themselves. And this is where I think it gets a little bit tricky for me, because, the Cancerian archetype and the Virgo archetype, but we're talking about Cancer here, have a lot to do with victimization. And so there can be an attachment to the identity of being a victim. And that's a really important component of healing for a lot of people, is to, understand the ways that they have been victimized. But as with all things Cancer, we can get attached to that ego identity. And so it's just kind of like, to what purpose does that serve? But oftentimes there is that trauma that happens in the early life with the combination of Cancer and Aquarius. And it doesn't have to be like overt, what we would think of trauma in terms of like severe abuse or just mild abuse. It can be, the parent being a single parent and having to work a lot out of the home a lot of times. And so the child's emotional needs aren't getting met. But it can also be something like, playing with friends and like having a great time running down the street. And then all of a sudden they fall and break their ankle. Right. And it's just kind of like zoop out of the body because the pain is so bad. And so a lot of times that's part of this dynamic as well, is that the child will experience something that creates emotional overwhelm. Right? It's just something that they cannot integrate. It's bigger than themselves. The emotions get so huge that the dissociation or the fragmentation happens as a part of the defense mechanism, or part of a survival mechanism, because if the child actually went into that state of overwhelm, they would risk, going into permanent disassociation. They would risk going insane, or that might be what it feels like. And so the Uranian function can kick in then as a protection mechanism. And again, that's the image, of somebody who's being abused, who's then viewing it from above. They've essentially like left the body. Their consciousness, Aquarius, has left the body and is staying in this spot over here in order to maintain integrity, right? So this part over here is safe. And that's part of what shamanic soul retrieval and past life regression work are trying to do, at least deep memory process, which is the form of past life regression work that I practice, is doing. It's trying to get those soul parts that have fragmented off, or those pieces of consciousness that have fragmented off, and bringing them back in to the solid and contained, mature adult ego. So that's the kind of like when the integration of Cancer and Capricorn has happened, then it's safe for those parts to come back and be reintegrated. Did that help with your question, Linda?
Yeah, it made me think that what you said was very helpful, that we need to understand why we were victimized, some of us, and to stand back and objectify. And I'm thinking with the square to Scorpio, we could ask, why the violence in early childhood? Why did we have these horrid experiences that traumatized us? So I'm looking at Scorpio and Taurus a little bit here as well. So I'm sure you'll bring that in later. But yeah, and also at school, how some people were separated in terms of, whatever, like racial separation, intellectual separation, even like putting like, I went to a Catholic school where this horrid nun put all the people from other races in one section of the class, including fat people and things like that. And that was traumatizing.
Yep.
So just sharing a few different kinds of trauma there.
Yeah, and I mean, that's really, really complicated and nuanced stuff too, because when it's collective trauma, it's like that. It is affecting everybody in unique and different ways, but it's still essentially calling people out for their difference and punishing them, but also showing the ones who aren't being called out for difference how scary and unsafe it is for them to do that. And so it's getting at that core kind of Cancerian archetype as well. What was the other thing I thought of there? I'm not sure. I'll probably come back to it at some point. A lot of times when I have the Moon and Uranus and Scorpio in the 4th house, squaring my Aquarian South Node and Sun. So a lot of my understanding of these is tinged with the Scorpio archetype as well. And I wish I could think of what I was, but alas, my head is a little bit foggy. So, a lot of times one way to think about Aquarius or Uranus and the Moon is that when you have Uranus and the Moon conjunct, it's like constant shocks to the emotional body, right? I mean, the emotional body is always shifting all the time anyway, but with Uranus there, there's constant shocks to it. And so it's people who can tend to be very changeable, right? Their moods are constantly shifting. And oftentimes there's a detachment, so they don't understand that. Like, I recognized that was going on in my own life when, after several years of noticing that I kept drawing people into my life who were very aloof and non-committal and very changeable, I started kind of reclaiming that and saying, well, where am I like this too? And I realized that, in fact, yeah, my mood does change a lot. And it's not necessarily in that kind of like super moody Cancerian way. It's that my actual energy shifts a lot. And people oftentimes don't know how to read me because of that. Like, I can be in my Aquarian mind thinking everything's all fine, but then if I tune into my emotional body, I'm like, oh, yeah, there's a lot of change going on there. And so another thing that comes in is that when we start to bring in the emotional body to things, and the theme of, the womb, we can think about, the fact that the child and the mother are literally connected for the first 10 months. And so the child is absorbing all the shocks of the mother, or everything of the mother. And so we get into more separation stories there, but we also get into the fact that it can be very difficult for the child to separate from that fully in early life. And so there's a continuation of absorbing shocks from the family, absorbing shocks from the mother. I had an experience actually several years ago. I have been spraining my ankle since I was 6, which is a very typical Aquarian thing because Aquarius rules the ankles. And it's just gotten progressively worse over time. And so I had a Reiki session several years ago because I have developed arthritis in my ankle because it's been sprained and broken so many times. It's just like bone on bone. And so I was going through a period where it was just really cranky and I was trying all these different things. And so I went to see somebody to get some Reiki done on my ankle. And afterwards, she said to me, she was like, I kept seeing an image of just a baby floating in golden light. And she was like perfectly happy and content. And she felt all warm and cozy. And then something happened and she got scared and she started shaking. And she was like, is there anything that happened to you while you were in the womb? That you know of, anything that happened to your mother? And I couldn't think of anything. But then it hit me suddenly a couple days later that when my mom was like 8 months pregnant with me, she broke her ankle. She was wearing platform shoes and she fell off of them and she broke her ankle. My dad got really, really, really angry and threw them in the trash. And it was just a perfect moment of like, oh, there's an internalization going on there of several different things: the actual physical injury, the emotions of not feeling safe, of falling very suddenly, right? And then the anger of the father coming through and kind of like clustering all that energy in the ankle. And my ankle felt a lot better after that. But just to show kind of like the different layers of how things like that can be held. So any questions, comments about that?
Yeah, what about the child with a mother who was very Aquarian, or a father, like, maybe like a crazy mother or something like that, and absorbing that trauma from other people and having to deal with them and perhaps mother them themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a self-mothering thing there, but there also can be the internalization of the same patterns, right? So there's an imprinting of those same patterns. And, what I was thinking about a lot when I was preparing for this was I work a lot of times with people who would label themselves as empaths. And I tend to associate empaths as in people who sponge emotions directly and internalize them, which is different than being empathetic, right? Empathy involves like thinking first, like you're sympathizing with something. An empath is somebody who just feels things as if they were their own. And oftentimes people who have very strong empathic tendencies have pretty crazy making childhoods, right? So the mother is very intense, or there is a lot of violence in the family, or it's just, a family of empaths where there aren't any boundaries and all of that. And what it actually got me thinking about was the glyph for Uranus, right? Which is actually, I drew it here for you, but you won't be able to read the writing because it's mirror image, but it is 2 moons, right? Going into the cross of matter that's grounded in the circle of spirit. And so there is this kind of echo going on between the sensitivity of Cancer, the moon, and the ideas of Uranus, right? I mean, in the glyph, we see it kind of like, so like if we take the crescent moons to represent receptivity and perceptiveness, and they're reaching out in this glyph from the right and the left brain, or from Capricorn and Pisces, and bringing it down through the cross of matter and grounding it into ideas or spirit. We can see something fairly compelling about the combination of these 2 archetypes. And just as a side note, I also did a little bit of research on the glyph, and I think that it actually started as something totally different, but this is what it looks like now. But again, there is that combination of, like, on the one hand, getting so much information and trying to figure out how to synthesize it into something. But going back to your original statement, Linda, it also has to do with that kind of like, there's that overwhelm that comes in. Like when there is radical insecurity within the family system, in early childhood, there is that sense of not being able to be grounded. And there can be a lot of, imprinting of the mental constructs of the family or the family mythology coming through. And so the thing about trauma, and I'm just kind of riffing freestyle here, but the thing about trauma is that even if there weren't huge jolts in the family system and in the child's current life, oftentimes little jolts in the childhood will reconstellate traumas from past lives, right? And so that's where we get back into the the idea of how trauma re-imprints and how it moves forward. And so, and the long-term memory component of Uranus. So, it's not to say that everybody who has Uranus moon aspects in their chart is going to have huge upheavals in their lifetime, right? Like mine was that my dad died very suddenly when I was 6 years old. Uranus moon conjunction in the 4th house, squaring the sun. And I mean, it wasn't a small event. It was definitely a big one. It definitely took me out of my body. Later on, when I was like 20 years old, I went into therapy and she had to do some present life regression with me and took me back to that moment. And we learned that I watched my mom tell me that my dad was dead from the doorway. And when the therapist suggested that I walk towards my 6-year-old self and give her a hug, I couldn't do it because the level of emotion was so high that it was overwhelming even to me as an adult to like witness it. And I hadn't experienced those emotions because I went somewhere else. But the other thing that happened during that moment was that all the other lifetimes where I experienced that kind of loss rippled into me at that point in time. And so that one event kind of catalyzed a lot of growth and change for this lifetime to me because, later on in my life, I then started using evolutionary astrology and past life regression to get to all the other storylines that were linked to that in this kind of string of karmic complexes. And so in that sense, what I'm seeing in my own practice is, I tend to get clients who are mirroring something to me about my own process, my own chart. And what I've been having for the past couple of years is people who walk in with these pretty intense combinations of Uranus, Moon, and oftentimes Scorpio in their charts, who are just straight out asking me or saying to me, I feel like I am processing ancestral trauma, or I feel like it's up to me to stop the line of madness that's been running through my family, usually through the matrilineal line. Or just asking me, is it possible that I'm processing generational trauma? And so when we think about it in terms of the symbolism, um, you know, oftentimes when it comes to past life work, heavy Aquarian karma is people who are processing a lot of collective trauma. Okay, so concrete example, people who died in the witch hunts or whatever. And so there's that aura of collective trauma that's coming through, but also in their past life regressions, when they transition through the death, they can see or feel all the other souls there that have died, that have been fragmented or disassociated due to the trauma. And so there's a level of healing that's going on there as they're dealing with that. So similarly speaking, when we're combining the more personal aspects using the Cancerian archetype, there seems to be that potential for generational trauma healing coming through as well. So whether this is people who, whose present life mother is also their past life mother, or, their past life child, there seems to be a lot of ancestral healing that is coming through as well. And, it doesn't always have to do with past life work. Sometimes it's just the act of, again, zooming out of the subjective experience and agreeing to make different choices. But the other thing that I'm seeing is that oftentimes it has to do with more of the genetic and literal womb space. And that is, women who are coming in who have had to have hysterectomies, who are having problems with their reproductive organs. And so there's more of a literal and concrete stopping of the ancestral line that's going through. And so there is that kind of literal symbolism of breaking free from, the womb, or breaking free from family trauma. And so I had put that earlier as, creating a new myth of family. And oftentimes people, especially with Uranus in the 4th house, will be very different from their families or the black sheep of the family. And sometimes they're able to come back in and maintain that, close bond with the family and bring the information from the outside to kind of like shift the ancestral dynamics from that part. But a lot of times there is too much trauma and the people are being forced to make decisions to break free from the family altogether, which is, again, this kind of constant dance between the emotional self, which feels radically insecure without the support of that traditional family structure, and the objective self, which knows these people, this system is not good for me, and I need to break away from it. Questions or comments?
Yeah, I'll just comment on that. I really related to a couple of things you said about totally breaking free of the family system, which is what I did. And I have Pluto in the 4th house, not Uranus, and an 8th house sun. But you said little jolts can reconstitute trauma from past life. So what's interesting is I would say my family was a very unstable system, mostly because my mother was, her mother grew up without parents, and she had 4 childhood diseases that almost killed her. She was very shut down. So it's interesting because I had sort of a strong father figure and I held it together. But then this one incident when I was 13, and I had been, popular and outgoing, I discovered there was this Barbara Hill hate club of my best friends. And at the time I thought I was okay with it, but then I actually had a breakdown like within a year. So I think there's that straw that breaks the camel's back sometime. And that kind of, I think it's our family's ancestral or matrilineal karma of kind of excommunication, and not being in a normal family, not being, so I just thought that was interesting because I never felt like there was an overt, physical abuse, but it was just very unstable. And so that one incident kind of like the whole house of cards fell down, and then it brought everything that was part of the generational and ancestral trauma to the fore for me to resolve on my own, basically, So, yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Hi, Amanda.
Hi.
This is Star.
Hi.
Well, first, I just want to say this is a great topic and that I really appreciate your work
Thanks.
very much. And I'm just curious, do you have any, in your experience, when you bring up the overwhelm that can happen with Aquarius, are there any good grounding techniques you suggest? Because I feel like I've heard them, but I personally struggle with when I get so overwhelmed that I lose myself. And I mean, I've done a couple years of therapy, support groups, meditate every morning. And I know the like go hug a tree, and that does help. And it's just in those moments of extreme, like whatever that overwhelm is, I'm just curious if you found anything that maybe works for you or other clients, is the first part of the question. And then I'm also more curious about what you think of the, not what you think of, but how would you suggest one goes about doing the soul retrieval part? Because I feel like I've got the 29th degree Aquarius moon.
Hold on. Can we come to that one next? I'm gonna lose the first question.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Sorry.
Okay. So the with the overwhelm thing, I do associate that more with Cancer than Aquarius. It's kind of like Cancer is the process of emotional overwhelm. Aquarius is more like the parts that go away, which they're linked, but not quite the same thing. And so when I think like, intellectually speaking about that process, I think about the Capricorn polarity to Cancer. And that is the process of kind of like Saturnian structures and boundaries, but also what is the point of, the evolutionary intention of this kind of like emotional overwhelm is to essentially help to develop the core sense of self-security and self, to bring it within, rather than externalize it. The intellectual stuff doesn't usually help at the practical level, however. And so what I always say first and foremost is deep breaths, like really deep breaths. It's often also a process of just saying like, I'm overwhelmed right now.
Got it.
And so then from there, for me, it's understanding that part of the nature of the Cancerian archetype is that it is always shifting. And so I know that I won't be stuck in overwhelm. It will shift out of it. So if I can take some deep breaths and drink some water and just kind of observe myself being in it, and be kind of like self-soothing, like, yeah, that's a horrible feeling to have. So there's the self-parenting thing coming in. I have a couple people in my life who kind of know what I'm like when I get overwhelmed. And so I can say, I'm really overwhelmed right now. And they will, instead of asking me like, what do you want to eat? They will just make me some food. Because if I get stuck into the like having to make decisions about it, it just keeps the overwhelm going. I've been through phases where I will use grounding stones. Obsidian's a great one. That usually works for my clients a lot of the time as well. Or like I have some clients who have like, weighted blankets and things like that. So there's something about containment, like the physical feeling of containment that happens as well. But just recognizing that it's an ongoing process. And like I said, that it will shift. Because I mean, especially when you're bringing Uranus and Aquarius together, there can be that like that overwhelming feeling of all the parts, right? Like the fragmentation, especially if you're a super sensitive person, you're aware of the fragmentation that is happening and has happened. And it's a little bit tricky, if not scary at times. And so then it is just figuring out ways, like, is it shielding? Is it calling the parts of you back home? And for me, it's just been a process of working with those things differently, or separately, I should say, over time.
Oh, that's really well said. I found when I do yoga and they place the sandbags on my hips in Shavasana, so when you mentioned the blankets and some kind of weight, great reminder. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so second question.
Well, so I've got a 29 degree Aquarius moon in the second house, square Uranus. So I've got the the Aquarius moon square Uranus happening. And then I'm just really fascinated with the idea of soul retrieval, because I've done a lot of work in therapy and support groups and meditation, a lot of stuff on my own. And I still find I'm really, like you said, that struggling with that deep insecurity and almost like just irrationally afraid of people or interacting with people. I mean, I can like leave the house and do normal stuff, but like I just being social or wanting to show up for somebody and do astrology, like I'm just find myself very terrified by that. And sorry, this is a little bit over, I'll wrap it up here, but what I'm trying to say is I know this woman that does clairvoyant energy healings, and they're pretty expensive, but the times I've been able to do them with her, I used to trade, I used to watch her dog and she would do them for me a lot when we lived in the same city. And I would always feel like a part of me came back that I don't know how to access on my own, and it would feel like without all the trauma and without all the overwhelm. And it always stayed with me for about a week, and I definitely could feel like I just felt in alignment with who I really am. And then it always goes back to this weird shock and all this other junk that I'm really trying to like work with. So now I'm thinking maybe that's the next step, is to go, I don't know that she actually knows if she's like a shamanic healer or not, but she definitely has that essence going on with her. And I just am not sure where to go next to investigate that.
To investigate the soul retrieval kind of stuff?
Yeah.
I mean, if I were you, I would look into deep memory process and the trainings that Patricia Walsh does. So those are geared towards kind of like past life soul retrieval. And so, you know, when we're dealing with soul loss and fragmentation, that's something that happens in this life. But again, it's kind of like past life stuff as well. And so it's bringing all those pieces back together again. And you have that, you know, trauma signature in the 11th house with Pluto and Saturn there. And so there is a lot of fragmentation, but also the intention to like shrug off your old conditioning and all of that. So soul retrieval is not necessarily something that you can do yourself. You know, shamanic practitioners will do it in one way, which is kind of like you lay down next to them and they will go get your soul parts for you. Deep memory process is more of a cathartic experience. And so it's geared towards moving trauma out of the emotional and physical bodies. With the idea that the mental catharsis, like the aha, it doesn't really do much. It's good to kind of connect the dots, but until the emotional body gets cleared, it's hard to shift them. The other thing that I would say to you is watch the pressure that you put on yourself to move through it quickly, because part of your nodal dynamic is it's important to keep that North Node in Cancer in the picture as well, because there is that kind of like nurturing thing that needs to happen. And with the Capricorn South Node squaring Saturn, there can be a tendency to be really hard on yourself. Mm-hmm. So that there's a, you know, the kind of like bonus of Saturn is it involves acceptance. Okay, so like knowing that like this is kind of like a lifelong process for you. And when you get soul parts back, when you get the soul retrieval done, it can be helpful to ask that soul part or the practitioner what it wants or what they want you to do in order to like kind of maintain it there. Because they'll come back, but then if we are, you know, intentionally or otherwise putting ourselves in situations that are similar, they'll go again. Yeah. Right? Not to say that's what's happening with you, but there is that kind of like it's a fine art.
Right. Well, I apologize if my question was overwhelming. Thank you so much.
No, you're good.
This topic is great.
Anyone else?
Amanda, what about trauma like that just keeps on repeating? For example, well, I know that's what we've been talking about, but with Chiron in Aquarius, the trauma keeps on repeating and it just feels like it's never really going to get healed. I mean, not fully healed. So any further tips on how to deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, what I can do is tell you where I'm at in that process. which is to say, like, it's not like a end all be all suggestion, but where I'm at in that process with the patterns that keep repeating, is acceptance. Again, it's this kind of, which is a strange thing to say because, you know, I used to laugh. I would say, like, whenever things are going really well in my life, that's part of me that's just bracing, waiting for the next hit to happen, waiting for the rug to get pulled out from under me again, right? That's the Aquarian shock. And I don't want to give too much energy into that mental thought pattern because I do believe that it somewhat perpetuates itself. However, my life experience has shown me that that's what tends to happen. And so the way that I deal with it when I'm not in the trauma is that I laugh about it a lot. And I cultivate really, really positive, life-affirming things for myself. And I try to have really joyful experiences because when I'm in the shock and trauma and overwhelm, I can reflect back on the times I wasn't there, and I can know that in the future they won't be there again. And so when I'm in it, it's that kind of like moving through it. Chiron in Aquarius is particularly interesting there because the nature of the Chiron wound is that it is something that can't be healed. So there's that need for acceptance again. And I think it's always healthy to kind of like go in with the attitude of like, yeah, I'm going to work on this in a new way, or I'm going to, you know, try and engage it differently. But again, I think that we can be too hard on ourselves sometimes. Especially if there is a lot of tendency towards fragmentation. It is that kind of like cultivating really good self-care practices for when we're in it, using a lot of laughter, because the laughter energy is not only cathartic in that it moves energy through, but it's taking the fear energy out of the root chakra and moving it into the heart chakra so that it can become love and abundance rather than more scarcity, insecurity energy. And like I said, at least that's where I'm at with it right now.
Oh, wow, that's really helpful. Yes, I think I have come to accept these problems. And I love what you said about acceptance, objectivity, joy, and humor. That is very, very helpful. And also, I think the one's differentness becomes our strength to stand out and be different. And from that place, we can then change things. What do you think?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Well, and then there's just the component of, you know, as I've noticed how slowly patterns change, especially because I have a lot of fixed signs in my chart, really paying attention when things are going differently. And so that involves a lot of being present in the moment, right? So like right now, I am not experiencing sudden loss, betrayal, and nightmare in family. In this moment, that's not happening. And it's just kind of like helping myself not to future trip or past trip and just being present with what is right now.
Yeah, very good. Okay, we have like about 7 minutes left. So if anyone has any questions or comments, please do go ahead.
Hi, Amanda. It's Carolyn speaking.
Hello.
I have Uranus out of bounds in the 3rd house in Cancer, square my natal moon. And that being said, I really appreciate your comments on accepting. I'll be 70 in October, and I've been accepting all my life for 6 decades and more. But it's a repeated process. It's not something that you do it and it's done, at least not for me. Mm-hmm. It just gets closer to the bone. And I go, okay, I got a little bit more of it. So the expectations are gone. When I joined EA Zoom meetings, I realized that to deal with the skip step, which I believe in, I have to do it or do it another lifetime, and I'd rather not, thank you. So I'm just going, okay. And then like with each meeting I attend, I learn something. Yeah. Jason Hawley and his Arcadian myth was hugely impressive for me. It cracked something entirely. I accepted, I dealt with. It's not easy, but it's what we look at my chart. It's what I signed up for.
Mm-hmm.
And I did have a horse for 6 years. So that helped. Anyway, I just want to say thank you, and that's where I am.
Great, thank you for sharing that.
I would just like to add one quick thing. I really resonated with what Linda said about making a strength out of your difference. Also, when there is a lot of jostling content of the nervous system, as in Star Trace's example of her Aquarian moon, the nervous system itself somatically gets overwhelmed. And there are ways to build in more capacity and resilience. So that, like, there's Feldenkrais, there's different exercises. So I just wanted to recommend to anyone who's interested in that more somatic aspect of approaching it. There's a Facebook group, Healthy Nervous System Evolution, that talks about a lot of this. And also, if you go to Irene Lyon's webpage, she actually has an exercise for overwhelm. And these are all somatic exercises that you actually go into your nervous system and calm it down. So I think that also helps with the grounding, just to be able to, apart from humor and, all those positive mental approaches, it really does help just to build more capacity into the nervous system. And for me, that's helped a lot. So I'm just putting in a pitch for that.
Great, thank you.
So, Amanda, with humor, that would then relate to Leo being the polarity, do you think? Bringing in that Leo, generosity and warmth and humor, and what do you think?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to me, it's again, like disclaimer, my North Node's in Leo, so I'm biased towards that, but there's something about cultivating joy, but there's also, Leo is all about coming back into the heart, right? So people who have the South Node in Aquarius, or like right now as a collective, we have South Node in Aquarius, it is healing dissociation and trauma by coming into the heart. And that can be done through joy and reconnecting with the things that we loved as a child. But it's also to say that process of coming into the heart, while it can be really joyful and opening and connective, it can also be a really painful experience, because when you're dealing with a lot of disassociation and trauma, you're oftentimes not used to feeling, you're oftentimes not used to being in the heart, you're oftentimes not used to having an open heart. And oftentimes I will laugh when I hear people say that they they want to open their heart more, because we do romanticize that, and I think it's for good reason, because it's necessary medicine, but also sometimes it hurts to come into the heart, right? Because that is essentially a metaphor for saying we're coming into feeling, we're coming into our emotional bodies. And so that's where Cancer and Leo once again meet, because Cancer is about taking care and nurturing those parts of ourselves so that we can express the Leo self or creative self-actualization piece from that kind of like more bouncy, joyful, childlike place.
And one final question from myself, what about through the moon's nodes, healing through the moon's nodes in one's chart?
Mm-hmm. Well, can you say a little bit more?
Well, you're talking about the moon, and so the moon's nodes, we have the transiting nodes, and then the moon's nodes are in other signs and houses, and I think bringing that into the picture, that could be part of the trauma signature.
Yeah, totally. A lot of times in charts, the nodes are the trauma or part of the trauma signature, like you just said. We can also see the kind of correspondence to what we're talking to, in that the nodes of the moon indicate the past life ego structure, because the South Node is inherently related to the moon. And so it helps with that understanding, again, of like who we've been, what we've been learning about, the kinds of areas of life that we've been stumbling through a lot. But there is some correspondence that I don't quite remember between the present life moon and the past life ego structure, so the south node, and that the current life moon is essentially like helping us to move through karmic stuff. And I'm
integrate perhaps the past with the present. And,
yeah, something like that. But it really is, to me, it's just that like using evolutionary astrology and what it has to say about the south node of the moon to understand what the patterns have been, and therefore how we are reworking them. And the specifics of that are going to be different for everyone.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Exactly. Yes. Okay, that brings us to the end of your meeting. What a great meeting. Thank you so much. Thank you from all of us, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. That was excellent.
Thank you. That was great.